Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thank you for stopping by again. I'm going to try to get a couple videos out this evening. Both of them focus on an individual or specific topic, and hopefully not quite as long as some of them. This one is going to take a few minutes, but it's really pretty straightforward. And the question is, do you need a lawyer? And I haven't heard that for a while, but I have recently from Europe. Europeans are just beginning to learn how the whole thing operates. So it's like talking to Americans and Canadians 10 years ago. But that's fine. That's normal. No problem there. But I am occasionally asked whether or not can I take my paperwork and go in and apply for a visa myself? And the answer is no. Do I have to have a lawyer? Yes. Okay, it's very, very simple. You have to keep in mind you're not looking for a tourist visa here. You're looking for a residency visa, which is often referred to as a permanent residency visa. And in the eyes of the law in Panama, once you have gone through that and you are a resident of the Republic of Panama, you have equal standing in the eyes of the law for, say, a property dispute, for example, or something else. But if you're a tourist, you don't have that. Now, residents are not citizens, so the politics of the whole thing, they have to stay out of that. No voting, no contributing money to a candidate, and so on and what have you. No, you can't hold public office. But this is logical. This is retained strictly for citizens. But as a resident, you have a lot of benefits, plus, of course, the financial benefits for older people and so on. So this is a lot more serious than a tourist visa. And the government insists that you be represented by somebody who can be held responsible, ultimately, for seeing to it that you have everything put together, it's in the right form, you've got it in logical order, you bring it in and you can explain it, he or she can explain it easily, and they can deal with this with lawyers very quickly. If you, as one of the thousands of individuals walking in their office, and many instances not even speaking Spanish, forget it, not going to happen. So, yes, you have to have a lawyer for that. In regards to property, purchase of property, or the creation of a business or something, actually you don't have to be a citizen. You can do that on a tourist visa. However, that brings up all sorts of other issues as well. And I would never suggest that anybody go down that road without having brought a lawyer in at the beginning. No, wait until you have a problem, please, at the beginning, to take a look at whatever it is you plan to do. So when your time comes that you want to buy a property, you need to find a lawyer, and that lawyer has to be your lawyer, not the seller's lawyer, as a rule, or the corporation that you're buying it from. You need to find your own, and the very first thing you're going to ask that person to do is to check all the background. And an attorney here can go into databases and information resources at the government that are not available to the general public, and very quickly can determine that the title is clear, that there are no taxes owed against the property, no liens against the property. These are things that would have to be paid if you bought the property without taking care of them, or insisting that the seller take care of them before you bought. So you want to know. And so he'll check for all of that. If there's any legal problems whatsoever associated with the property, he or she should be able to find it without major difficulty. And that's the first step, to realize that you've actually got a real property here that actually is titled and can be purchased, and you can own it. And that's fine. Now, the same with the business. There's a lot of ins and outs of a business. Nobody sets up a business here on their own without a lawyer unless they're asking for trouble later on. And it's something very tiny. I mean, somebody goes around and does some handyman work on the side for other expats. I mean, no one cares. But if you're actually talking about setting up a business, you need to get all this done. You're going to have employees, ye lords. Yes, you must. So lawyers are very, very, very useful people, even if they frustrate us sometimes. And they're particularly true when you're dealing in a foreign country. At least it's foreign to you at this stage. And you don't know how things operate, and you very often don't speak the language. For heaven's sakes, if there was ever a time when you needed legal advice, this is the time. Now, that brings us to the third question, which is, how do I find a lawyer? And that can depend. The standard way I've approached it for years is to say to people that when you found the area you want to live in, and you found a property that really interests you and so forth, or you're just beginning to look even, and you're talking, you run into expats, ask them if they know lawyers and what their opinions are of the lawyers, are they good lawyers, and so forth. That's helpful. Since then, I have really added to that. I've suggested whenever possible that you look at you go into a business that's owned by an expatriate. Okay. Now, an expatriate doesn't have to be from your country. It can be from any country outside of Panama, even Latin America. But the point is that you find somebody who is not a Panamanian, who has set up a business here, and ask them their experience. Because if you're setting up a business, it's a lot more complex, it's a lot more involved than just getting a residency visa. And they may have had a bad experience, or they may have had an excellent experience, or whatever, but they really get a lot more and expect a lot more from a lawyer than somebody who's just looking for a residency visa. So I talk to them about that too. I'd ask people, get as much information as I can. And then if someone sounds good, and particularly if I have a couple business people, often, pretty much everywhere in the country there are non-Panamanians who own businesses, so you can find them. And there's nothing wrong with asking a Panamanian, but given that you're an expatriate, you might be more comfortable asking another expatriate who had to go through the process for advice. But yeah, talk to people. Go to the Facebook pages, different groups in Panama. You can find them if you're really interested. The Yahoo groups are not quite as useful as they once were, but still, there are ways to do it. I think the best is the face-to-face talk with expats in country when you're here. And then check out that lawyer that sounds interesting to you, and if you feel comfortable with her, fine. If you don't, then look for somebody else. Don't worry about this. Just do it. And you will eventually come up with somebody that maybe has 2 references and so on, and seems like a great person. You get along well. They're professional. All right. This is not rocket science. Getting a visa or setting up a small business here, it's not rocket science, as we say in English. It's not that difficult. But there are lots of ins and outs, and if you want a lawyer who's done it before, and most of them here have done visas over and over and over again. That's no big deal. The business may be different depending on what kind of business it is. But again, the only person who can really respond to that is somebody who has the legal knowledge required for it. So yes, you don't need a lawyer, but you're wise to get one. The worst problems, and I mean some of them are nightmares, are people who have come down. They are not residents. They become emotionally involved with a particular property. It could be a beautiful home or just a beautiful piece of land with a glorious view or one thing or another. Really, really, they just love it. And they want it. And they're determined to buy it. And they get so excited and they're so convinced that this is the right thing. They move on. They sign contracts without having had the contract reviewed by a lawyer. No, don't do that. Look, I've been here, when I first came here, it would be my 15th anniversary of my first arrival. About 11 years since I was full-time. I was half-time here prior to that. But I've been through a lot of stuff here. But when I moved recently and I had a new rental agreement, it's a very straightforward agreement, and I can read most of it and certainly figure out the rest of it. But I didn't bother with that. I just sent it to my lawyer. And I said, please run through this and tell me if there's anything in here that looks funny. And he did, and he said, no, it looks like a perfectly reasonable one. And since I'd been around for a number of years, and and he mentioned 2 or 3 things, but they were nothing that came as a surprise. Perfectly normal rental agreement. So I signed it, but I would never have signed it until he'd told me that, even though I had read through it myself and thought it looked good. No. So I think that most of the serious problems I have run into, or people I've known have run into and have written me about, you go back to the beginning and discover that they didn't use a lawyer. And now they're using a lawyer because they've got problems, and they're paying a lot more money than they would have paid if they just run it by a lawyer. Having a lawyer read through a contract is not $1,000 experience. I mean, you may be paying him that much because you're getting a visa or you're setting up a corporation or so forth and what have you, much of which is going to fees to the government, of course. But the key point is that particular activity will add to your bill very little, and it can protect you. Because I've seen too many times when people have not done it and it has failed. So above all, do what Panamanians do. I know a lot of Panamanians, certainly in real estate, but also people who just own their own homes, and just like you and I and everything else. They have lawyers, used sometimes in the family, which helps. But one of the first questions they'll ask when they're looking at a property is the land titled? And if it isn't titled, and some land here is not titled to an individual, then they say thank you and go their way. Now, I'm not going to go into the involved discussion of the kind of land that is untitled here, because actually it's a nice history story. It was exactly the same thing in the United States of America and in Canada, and it's been true of every single country on the planet at some point in its history when nobody had a survey, and yet people were living in places and there were disputes over properties. So it became critical that there be a survey of some kind, some specific description of the property that's owned or the home owned, that was given to or filed with the government or what have you, the council of elders or whoever was in charge. So it was clearly understood what that person owned. And that is titling, but nowadays would just be referred to as titling. It's critical. In many countries, like Panama, in the days before there were large numbers of expatriates running around and so forth, and when life was a lot simpler in the 20th century, many of the farmers out in the rural areas particularly, and the further away from Panama City you go, the more you see this, simply didn't have the money to pay for a surveyor to come all the way out to their little rural property and then survey it, and then do all the paperwork and everything else that's required and the legal expenses to title it. They just didn't have that kind of money, and even if they did, they didn't want to spend it because out there in the rural areas, people knew each other, they had understandings, there'd be a dispute, it would be settled within the community and so forth. But that's all gone. So it's very important, and the government knows that. We all know that land get titled, because if the land is not titled to somebody, who owns it? And the answer to that is the government. So no matter what kind of a contractual arrangement you make with whomever is living on that land and so on, you don't own that land when you pay that person. If you don't have title, then at any time the government chooses, it can give you notice to leave. And you have to go. You don't have a choice. If you've been there for a while and so forth, they provide some form of compensation. They just don't throw people off their land entirely, not their land, but out of their homes entirely. But what is considered to be reasonable compensation for a rural Panamanian family may not strike you as particularly reasonable. The whole point is, don't do it. I'm serious. If you've lived here for a while and you really have found a lawyer you really like who has done this very thing, titling, and so forth, and knows how to, it's a delicate topic. It has to be agreed to by the neighbors. I mean, there's all sorts of complications that can pop up, and expenses, so that you just don't want to get trapped in it unless you know you're going to come out of it okay. And that's not always the case. So the reason people do this and people get excited about it is because the person selling does not have title. They do not own the land. Then they can't. They aren't selling it. They can't. And they'll sell it. Basically, they'll move out of their little house, or if they have one, or they'll take their cattle off the land or whatever, and you can build your little house on it and so forth, but you don't own the land. You just replace them as the person who's residing in that particular piece of property. You can title it, but it's going to be much more difficult, very frequently, for somebody who's only lived there for 3 months to convince people that they have a long-term involvement with this land and it should be theirs. I'm not going to go any further. This sort of land is disappearing, and the government is doing a wonderful job, and they've been doing it every administration now since I arrived. And the amount of land that's of any interest to anybody for sale is that is not titled is being reduced every single year, and dramatically still. I mean, tens of thousands of households have gotten titled to their land. So I really don't care how beautiful that piece of land may be that you see, which is not titled. There are 150, there are 200 others, every bit as beautiful, even more so, that are titled. So keep that in mind. The one big thing is that the person selling it is going to sell it to you really, really cheaply, and that's what really traps people. Oh, I mean, it's so little money. Wow, and they tell me I can get it titled, and it's not a big deal, and everything can be taken care of. And the further you get away from Panama City, in the rural areas out in the middle of nowhere, so to speak, the more likely you are to run into this situation. And since most of you aren't going to be out there, you're not going to run into this situation. But you always ask at any property, is it titled? It's a simple question. Everybody expects it. And you should hear the answer is yes, and then you should have it checked by a lawyer. That's simple. And avoid a terrific amount of problems otherwise. I can give you some stories that curl the hair on your head. There's particularly a problem up in Bocas del Toro. Now, you may have heard of Bocas. It's a beautiful area, but what they're talking about are the islands off the coast, and that's where many expats have lived, and it's turned into a little community up there. They had hell on wheels up there, getting there. They were scammed left and conned left and right up. It was terrible. Really painful. And they were so far away from the government main offices down here. It was getting any attention was very difficult. And the police up in that area weren't particularly concerned about a bunch of foreigners running around, making all sorts of accusations and so forth. But they stuck it out, and they got it worked out, and they finished it. And now on the islands, this has been taken care of, basically. If you go to the islands to look for a place there, then by all means, talk to the people who were there. They have been there. They've done that. They have the T-shirt, so to speak. However, in the mainland of Bocas del Toro, there's much less of that, very little. So we hear most of those problems coming from that part of the country. Don't do it. So yes, you need a lawyer, or you should have a lawyer, or if you are ever going to consider purchasing land that is not titled, always do it only with a lawyer, a lawyer you trust, that you have found through independent contacts, not through anybody else. And that, just put it aside. Live here for a while. Stay here for a year or two and rent or whatever. Don't buy untitled land until you really know what you're doing. Let's get that out of the question. I'm not going to talk about it again because it's just not worth the effort. Otherwise, though, this gives you an idea. And yeah, you can find lawyers here. How do you find a lawyer? You just, as I say, you talk to local people, local expats as well as local Panamanians. Just keep talking. You'd be surprised how many people will answer. Business owners are at the top of my list, though. So that's something to think about, and I hope that answers people's questions. Thanks for stopping by. I'll get another one out tonight if I have the time. Thanks.